Hello, this is Mike Arnott, Coors Engineering, and welcome to another Mach2 instructional video. Today, what we're going to talk about is settings pages. Settings pages is one of the more maybe underutilized but really powerful features within the Mach2 world. The basic idea behind it is having settings pages or the ability to create settings pages lets you build custom user or administrator configurable settings that can be used to control the way a work center functions. So basic idea is you can create your own list of configurable editable properties for a given work center. So you can enable and disable things, change settings, change anything numbers. They can be strings, they can be bits or booleans. So it gives you kind of this powerful way to build a dynamic user interface that lets someone configure your logic without ever having to go into the logic. All right? So what I'm going to show you today is just that. So we're going to go in and build a settings page within Mach2, just like the built-in pages that you're used to. If you've been using Mach2 for a while, you're familiar with our settings pages. We have global settings. We have individual work center settings. And at the end of the day, these are pages, and these pages are actually built using our settings page builders or objects. So these are all dynamic. These are all configured actually in a wire sheet. These are not hard-coded pages. You're not going to go in and find an HTML or a JavaScript page somewhere that has all these settings on it. That's not how it works. Settings are actually created using logic objects on wire sheets. So following the concept within Mach2 of content objects, you should be familiar with the idea that we try to build objects that basically can be represented in a web page on a wire sheet. So we're literally creating content, creating views, HTML views, using the logic editor, using the wire sheets. So today what I'm going to do is I'm not going to dig too deep into the logic that I'm going to build or that I already built because that's not why we're here. We're not here to talk about the function that I created. What we're here to talk about is how to add settings to the function that I created. So in this case, the function that I created, a pretty common thing for us, is an idle timeout logic. Basic thought process is if I have a work center and that work center is in a down state, and the cycle counter changes, well, that kind of indicates the machine is running, and therefore we're going to do a work center status change transaction in Plex and change the status of the work center to production. And vice versa, when the machine is in production and stops running, the logic would then trigger a downtime event to Plex. And that's where our configuration is going to come in. Logically, different types of work centers are going to have different durations before the timeout, right? And if you've got a very high speed, very automatic machine, if it stops for more than a couple of normal cycle times, that means it's probably down. But if you got a very manual process with a fairly long cycle time, maybe it's normal for it to have pauses for setup events or something like that. So you might want to have a longer delay between cycles that it would then trigger a downtime transaction to Plex. Plus, you might actually have different downtime states or reasons from work center to work center. So maybe if you've got equipment specific downtime reasons, you might want to have a different downtime reason for one machine versus another. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to build into a settings page is this ability to control how and when the idle timeout happens and what information gets sent to Plex when it does happen. All right, so this is my idle timeout folder. It's already linked into my my logic page. Things that are custom should always be in the logic page. You've already been through that training, hopefully. But anyhow, we have this idle timeout folder. And obviously I want to make this idle timeout folder reusable. I want to paste it into other work centers, or make it part of my template so that it's automatically in all of my work centers. So, the rule of thumb applies. If I'm going to make something custom, I should do it here. And because I want this idle timeout to be, self-sufficient or completely contained, I'm actually going to create the settings page in the idle timeout folder. Right? So not too complicated logic. Again, I'm not going to go all the way through this, but the basics of it are the things that I'm going to make settings is I'm going to make a setting for whether or not this is enabled, right? I want to be able to turn it off. I want to be able to disable the ability for this automatic event to occur. So we're going to have an enabled setting. Delta T, in this case, this is how many cycle times should I wait before sending the downtime event? In other words, if my cycle time is a minute and I have this set to 5, what that means is if I haven't made a cycle in 5 minutes and I'm in production, I'm going to send a downtime event. This is what we're going to make. We're going to make this variable. So how many cycle times between events? And then the other thing that we're going to do is I have some, in this case, hard-coded downtime reasons and states. We're going to make those variables. I want to be able to have a settings page that lets me choose what downtime state and reason I'm going to send to Plex when I have that timeout event. So that's the page we're going to build. We're going to have, like I said, those are the settings that I want to put on it. And so that's how we're going to move forward here. So to start with, first thing we have to do is go to our settings palette. So there is a CORS library called CORS settings, and the CORS settings palette has all those objects that we're going to use to put together a settings page. It's a bit of a hierarchy when you're creating one of these settings pages. There's actually kind of a layer that you have to build, and it's a pretty specific structure that you want to put together for it to look, act, and feel and work correctly. The first thing that you always have to add, the top layer, if you will, of having a settings page is the object called settings folder. The settings folder is in the core settings under containers. That's the root object that you're always going to use. So to add it to my idle timeout logic, I'm literally just going to drag and drop a settings folder object onto my page, and I'm going to call it idle timeout settings, just so that we know what it is. All right. First thing I need to do with that is I need to give it a name. This is a page, so it's going to be a hyperlink on our settings. So logically, I have to say what the title or the link should say. So I'm actually have to go to this object's wire sheet, just so you know how all of these settings objects work, or at least the infrastructure page settings objects. If you double click on them, you're going to get a wire sheet because we're assuming that you're going to add more content to that thing, in this case, the page or the folder. So if you want to get into this object's settings, you actually have to change to the property sheet to do so. So the most important piece here is the title. What do you want to call this thing? So we're going to call it the idle timeout settings page. So that's going to be the name on the hyperlink to get to this settings page. All right. So now to my idle timeout settings page, I need to next add a tab. Tab is generally the next layer in building a settings page. You can have more than one tab, but you need one. So to my idle timeout settings folder object, I am going to add a settings tab object. And just like the folder object, I need to say what it says or what it looks like. Again, if I double click on it, I'm going to get its wire sheet. So if I want to change the name of that tab, I have to go to its property sheet and say what I want that tab to be called. I'm just going to call it settings. Let's call it timeout settings, just so you kind of see what that looks like. All right, so that's going to be that object's or that tab's name. All right, back to the wire sheet. Now to my settings tab, in general, the next layer that you're going to have is a table. There are other objects that you can add, but think of a table, if you're used to HTML, think of it as a div, right? It's a box into which I'm going to add settings, individual settings, right? So this is a place to put my settings on my page. So I'm going to add a settings table object. Again, when you double click on it, again, notice how deep we are now. We're in the idle timeout folder, idle timeout settings folder, settings folder object, settings tab object, and settings table object. So I'm on its wire sheet. Just like the first three or two, if I want to change the name of that thing, I have to go to its property sheet. Settings table seems pretty reasonably. Maybe I'll just call it settings. Now I'm ready to add things. So again, I'm now in my settings table wire sheet, and here I'm actually going to add settings. So for this particular instance, the settings that I'm looking for are, I need that enabled, I need that count, cycle timer number multiplier, and I need some strings for my individual work center statuses. I need the 2 reasons and 2 states, so 4 strings altogether. In the settings objects, the things that you're going to use most often are really kind of these bottom ones. These are the actual settings. So Boolean, number, string, enum, and color. Obviously, color is a little more rare, but it's a setting object. And really, it's those first 3 that you're going to use: Booleans, numbers, and strings. The settings action button is if you want to actually have a button on that settings page to invoke an action on a wire sheet object. That's kind of rare. And then the settings text, think of this as a dynamic label. It's read only, but you might want to have some information or some feedback in your settings page. Like if I enable something, I might want to get feedback that it actually is working. We use that a lot, like with our, if we're doing like a TCP communication, maybe to a scale or to a barcode scanner or something like that, we'll put some text in there that basically says whether or not that socket is working. So feedback information. But in our case, we need 3. We need Booleans, we need numbers, and we need strings. So I'm going to start with the setting Boolean called enabled. Right. So this is going to be our on-off. And just like the last objects, if I want to give it a name, I have to actually go into its properties and say, what is this setting called? So we are going to say enable idle timeout. And then I'm going to add a number. That number is going to be my multiplier for my how many cycle times do I wait before sending the idle timeout logic. And we're going to call that one multiplier. And then again, I have to go in and give it a name. So we're going to call it cycle time times to timeout. And then I'm going to add a string for my production status. And I'm going to give it a name. All right, and now through the magic of video, I'm going to add the other 3. I'll be back in a second. All right, so I added in the other 3 strings just to save a little time on the video. So we have our settings created. They have a page, the page has a tab has a table has settings. So that's always kind of the basic structure that you're going to want to build for this. If you want to see what that looks like, we can navigate over to Mach2, and what you're going to see is now when I navigate to my settings page, let's start from the beginning here. When I navigate to my settings page for mic test, this is the work center that I was working on, work center 1. Notice that in addition to the built-in Mach2 settings page, you also have idle timeout settings. So this is that custom page that we created that has the settings specifically to my idle timeout logic. Navigate there and you're going to see this is my page called idle timeout settings. In that page, I created a tab called timeout settings. In that tab, I created a table called settings. And here are my 6 settings. So my enabled, my cycles, the timeout, and my 4 strings. So we already have that custom interface. I'm just going to go ahead and put some values in here so that you see the results, and you will see them on our page once we go back to the wire sheet. All right. I'll save all these guys. Notice the Boolean, you don't actually have to save it. All right. So created a settings page. I can now go in and tweak and change any of my settings. Last thing to do is to take those settings then and make it part of my logic. So on the idle timeout wire sheet, I just have the folder object. I don't actually have it. It's not linkable. I can't link directly to my settings because they're 3 or 4 layers deep in the tree. So again, use just standard Mach2 functionality. We are going to composite those outputs to make them part of my settings folder so that I can then link it to my logic. So we're just going to do the normal composite function in my tree. So folder, tab, table, settings. Each of these settings objects is going to have an output. So regardless of the type of setting, it will have an out slot. And that out slot is what you're going to want to expose to your page. The one thing to notice as I'm doing this, when you create these, obviously the name is going to be generic. We're going to have to go in and fix all of our names, but also notice that the direction is wrong. Unfortunately, it's inferring these as inputs. We are going to have to go in and change those to be outputs. So you have to change the direction on all these and then give them names. So this is going to be our enabled cycles. And I sped up the video a little bit there so you didn't have to watch me type. So now we have our 6 slots configured with names and the direction is proper. All right. So now you can see there are the values that I keyed in. So there's my blah, 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 test, test. So those are the values that I edited or added to that settings page. So the last part is then to link it into my logic. So that was my cycle timer. My enabled goes here. Oops, here. And the last part is all my strings. My strings link into my logic here. And we're done. We have now created a custom settings page in Mach2, and that custom settings page shows up when I navigate to my work center. It has all of the settings that I need to be able to customize how and when my idle timeout logic works. And obviously this is work center specific because this logic folder that I created, this idle timeout logic that has idle timeout settings, is actually in specifically this work center one. And it's portable. If I want to take the idle timeout logic and copy it to another work center, or even put it into my template to make it part of what gets created whenever I create a new work center, it's all self-contained. The logic and the settings pages is all part of this idle timeout folder. There are other places to explore. Obviously, the core settings tab has lots, including a work in progress folder. But there's backup and restore functionality that's available. status input and scrap input. These are very, very specific settings objects that were created. You kind of might be familiar with those again if you've used the Mach2 settings page, the built-in ones. We actually did create some very specific user interface functionality for configuring scrap and configuring status. So that's what these status input and scrap input objects are for. But the rest, I mean, that's the basics. Again, you can do booleans, numbers, strings, enums, and colors. Those are the 5 basic settings types that you can add. But again, your page can be as complicated as you want it to be. You can have multiple tabs. You can have multiple settings tables within your settings tab. And as you do that, the page is actually going to dynamically adjust itself. So I just had one settings table. If I go in and add more settings tables, what you're going to see is when I go back to Mach2 and go back to my custom settings page for idle timeout, notice I have 2 more tables. So by adding those table objects, now I have 2 more settings tables within this tab. These are actually based on geography. So notice I'm physically moving the settings table objects around on my wire sheet. And when I go back to my settings tab, notice physically they moved. So you actually arrange the objects on the wire sheet, and it will actually dynamically change the way that your settings page works. Right? So a very powerful tool. The same is true with the tabs. If I have multiple tabs within my settings folder, then what you're going to see is, as I add these tabs on my page, again, it's going to add them to my infrastructure, to my setup here. And if I name them, so if I can give a name, it's the same basic idea, right? So if I go to the property sheet and I call this one tab 2, right, you'll see that tab 2 is here. If I go back to my wire sheet where my tabs are and move that one over here, now tab 2 is over here. So very dynamic, very flexible, very powerful tool. This ability to create any kind of user configurable settings to then link and add and use in your logic. All right, that wraps up this one. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us through the WeSpeakMachine.com website or contact me directly. It's just Mike at CoresEngineering.com. Thank you.